PowerPoint for Chapter 5, Victim Rights and Remedies. So we talked a little bit in the first chapter about victimization not so much seen as a crime against the victim, but rather a crime against the state. So victims were generally ignored by the criminal justice system until about the late 70s, early 80s. So now victims are granted a range of rights. The first law that guaranteed victim rights was passed in Wisconsin. Again, 1979 to 1980 is kind of when this all happened. And now every state has some form of victim rights. Some states are a little bit better than others, of course. So slightly less than half of US states give all victims rights. So in all states, victims have the right to compensation for money that they have lost. They have the right to be notified of goings-on in their case. They have the right to notification of court appearances, so what's happening in court with their case. And they have the right to submit victim impact statements. So here in Texas, we have the Texas Victim Services, and they provide an avenue for crime victims to participate in the criminal justice system. So this was founded in 1993. And you can see in the little pie graph here the different types of victimization people have experienced for those people that go to the Texas Victim Services. So generally, it's mostly violent crimes. You can see only 2% is theft, fraud, or financial crime. So generally, more victims of violent crime go to seek these victim services. So the Crime Victims Compensation here in Texas was founded in 1979, and victims can apply for compensation. So this means financial compensation. And then if you are the victims of a juvenile crime, you can go to the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. So the first right that all victims in the United States have the right to have is notification of their case. So this means that a victim has a right to know what's going on in their case, what is going on with the offender. They get notified when the offender is arrested. If they get released on bail, they'll be notified whether or not they accept a plea bargain, parole hearings that they might have after they've been convicted, and once they are released from incarceration. So the victim has the right to be notified of all these things. In Texas, when an offender dies, when they escape from custody, or when they return to prison, they are also notified. And generally, this happens through a phone call, a text message, an email. Of course, some victims, you just can't get a hold of them, so that's a little bit more difficult. But generally, you get notified in all these goings-on in your case. So the criminal justice system, a major goal it has for victims is to increase the participation and consultation by victims in all stages. So they really want victims to feel like they are part of the process. They want them to feel like they've been treated fairly, that they're important, that their case is important, that the offender gets what they feel is sufficient punishment. So victims that are a part of this, that are part of the court case, etc., get to sit in on sentencing and give their opinions. They're generally much more satisfied with the criminal justice process. And if a victim is more satisfied with the criminal justice process, they're probably going to be more likely to report being victimized if they're victimized again. So another way victims might participate is by consulting with judges. So judges and or prosecutors, so they might take the victim's recommendations into consideration. So before any plea bargains are offered, a lot of times they'll go to the victim and say, okay, are you, is this sufficient with you? Are you okay with this? If bail is set, and it might be also occur before an offender is paroled or sentenced. So at parole hearings, when they get released from incarceration, a lot of times the victim is allowed to be present there and give a statement for whether they think that the offender should be paroled or not. So victims might also need protection from the offender, especially, in violent cases. And victims have a right to have a separate waiting area in a courtroom. So they don't necessarily have to, sit on a bench beside their offender while they wait to go into the courtroom. They have the right to have their own separate area so they don't have to be around the offender. So victims might also be fearful of the offender and the offender's friends and family. So victims have a right for orders of protection against the offender or their, friends and family. And they also have a right to privacy, so keeping the information of the victim private so the offender can't, find out where they live, what they're doing. So participation in the criminal justice system might in fact endanger victims, and this is a reason that victims do not want to be part of the criminal justice process and why they might choose to, not come to court to see what's going on with their case. So a goal of victims' rights advocates is to make this as safe for them as possible, so they still get to participate while still feeling safe. So for an example here, we have Lauren McCluskey. So this was in the news maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. So Lauren was a college student at University of Utah, and she was murdered by an ex-boyfriend. So she did not know this when she started dating him, but she found out that he was actually on parole and a sex offender. So when she found this out, she broke up with him, and then she received threats and extortion attempts from this former boyfriend. So Lauren did exactly what she was supposed to do. She went to the university police department several times and reported that this guy was, threatening her and attempting to extort money from her. So the police officer really did not do anything to protect Lauren, and many people do feel that that the police department for University of Utah was partially responsible for Lauren's murder. So this just goes to show if victims' rights aren't protected, so the right to protection was not afforded to her, even though she was, a victim of threats and extortion attempts, and this horrible thing happened. So in 2019, a bill was signed into law that requires the university police departments to better protect their students. So another right that is afforded to victims in some cases is the right to a speedy trial. So the judge really needs to consider the victim's interest when ruling on motions for continuance. We know that the court process takes a very, very long time, and there's all sorts of continuances for whatever reason, the evidence, isn't ready or whatever. So while, offenders have the right to a speedy trial, the victim has a right to a speedy trial as well. This is not something that is available in every single state. Right now it's provided by about half of states. Here in Texas, they only provide this if the victim is under 17 and the victim of a violent crime. So delayed trials, they lead to unnecessary anxiety and trauma. Usually, the victims just want to get this over with. They want, their offender to get punished sufficiently. They want to put this behind them. And when you have all these continuances for, they might think are not good reasons, then, it drags on and it's just harder on the victims. Okay, so for evidence, crime victims have the right to have any of their property that has been taken as evidence returned to them. Same, like I said before, the court process takes usually a very long time, so they might not get their property back very quickly, but they do have the right to have that property back. So when someone is sexually assaulted, they will do a rape kit, and rape victims have the right to not have to pay to get this rape kit done, so the state should cover the cost of this. And then some states have a right where they can store it free of charge, even if they decide to not move forward with the case at the time. So maybe they just, don't want they reported their rape, but they don't want the offender charged. Some states will store this rape case for a rape kit as long as they can, and they can decide at a later date that they want to move forward with the case. So here in Texas, sexual assault victims have the right to be notified when DNA is tested. and when there is a DNA match. So if they think that they have a suspect and they are going to test the DNA, a sexual assault victim will be notified of this in Texas. Of course, there's many issues with victims' rights. So many states don't have a specific enforcement strategy in place in their victims' rights legislation. So again, laws are written so that a crime is a harm against the state rather than the victim. And victims don't really have a lot of options if their rights aren't protected. So if their rights aren't protected, they're not getting what they should be getting. Maybe they're not getting notified of their case. Maybe they're not receiving the compensation that they should. This really erodes confidence in the criminal justice system. And then again, if they get re-victimized, they're going to be less likely to report this victimization. There's also not an equitable access to justice. So a lot of the time, people that, for example, if somebody is homeless and a victim of crime, maybe they aren't getting their notifications if they don't have a phone, if they don't have, access to a computer. So not everyone is going to, be able to get these rights and remedies equitably. So not everyone has the same access. Of course, some of these services that victims' rights offers are difficult to actually get. So victim service providers report that there's a lot of services that they just simply can't give to victims. For example, shelter housing is something that not a lot of victims are able to get. So only like 80.9% of all victim service providers said that actually it was difficult for people that needed shelter and housing to access it. So generally this is going to be victims of domestic violence if they can't stay in the home. Domestic violence shelters, there's not enough of them. They're often full. Maybe they're not able to bring their pets or their kids along, so they don't want to go. So this is something that is very, difficult to access. Over 80% of victim service providers say that it's difficult. Mental health services, financial services, also very difficult. Justice-related assistance, only 4.4%, so that's good. At least, we're doing good in that regard. Okay, so victims of federal crimes also have rights. So federal crimes are certain crimes, either they cross jurisdictions or they have specific jurisdictions for the federal law. So this could be a bank robbery, child pornography, some sort of financial crimes. A lot of white-collar crimes are also federal crimes. Kidnapping, human trafficking, terrorism, these are all considered federal crimes, so not dealt with by the state law, but dealt with by the FBI instead. So one option that they have is the Federal Victim Witness Protection Act. So the Attorney General at the time in 1982 developed and implemented guidelines that outline for officials how to respond to victims and witnesses. Okay, so compensation is financial compensation for economic losses. So these are usually run by the state, and it can include mental health counseling, medical care, funeral costs, lost wages, and sexual assault exams. So it doesn't include property loss, and then most states also do not cover pain and suffering. So this is not necessarily automatic, and not everyone who applies receives the funds. So these funds come from a few different places. So the Victims of Crime Act, the Victim Crime Fund. So money from federal crime funds, whether it be a donation or gift, forfeited bail bonds as well is something that sort of where the pool of money comes from for this victim compensation. Currently, as of 2021, it sits that we have $2.6 billion to spend, and different amounts are allocated to different states. In Texas, we get quite a good chunk of that. We get $24 million, which seems like a lot of money, but when you think about all the financial costs that these victims of crimes have, it's really not that much. So generally, we only give compensation to victims of violent crime. So victims of rape, assault, child sexual abuse, if you're injured in a drunk driving accident, domestic violence, and homicide. So you're not necessarily going to receive any sort of compensation from the government for property losses. So restitution is also a financial remedy, but it is paid by the offender to the victim. So it's not coming from state funds or federal funds, it's coming directly from the offender. So this is usually court ordered. So usually they will say during sentencing that maybe the offender is sentenced to 12 months probation and have to pay back, what they stole from the victim. And this can cover lost property, medical expenses, lost wages, but again, not the pain and suffering. So, several problems with this. First of all, you're not going to get restitution if your offender is not caught and sentenced and found guilty. So this has to happen first, and we know that a lot of times if maybe this goes to plea, maybe this goes, they just, don't know who did it, maybe there's not enough evidence, so it's not a guarantee that the victim is going to receive this restitution. Sometimes they might steal sentimental items that don't have a large value, but they could have a large sentimental value, like maybe like an old family heirloom that isn't really worth anything to anyone except for the person that it belongs to. And then most offenders don't necessarily have money that they're able to pay back. A lot of times, especially if they get sentenced to prison, they're not going to be able to pay back that money. So while it's a nice I guess thing to get restitution, it does not mean that you're actually going to see any of that money. Okay, so just a little example here about restitution. This is, if you heard this case, The Tinder Swindler. It's a really interesting documentary if you haven't already watched it. This one guy goes on Tinder and tricks all these women, and he ends up stealing over $10 million from women on Tinder from all around the world. So he was finally arrested and served a very short jail sentence. And these victims that got scammed out of all this money did not receive any sort of restitution from them. So I guess this was not part of his sentence at all. I'm not too sure why that is. If it was because it was international, there were so many different jurisdictions that they couldn't do it, I'm not too sure. But anyways, his victims here are all struggling to get their lives back together, and he, after a short little jail sentence, continues to spend all their money and live pretty lavishly. So while the victims aren't getting restitution from him, they have launched a GoFundMe to get some of their money back. Okay, so one option that victims have is civil litigation. So victims can seek money for emotional as well as physical harm. So this is where the pain and suffering comes in. This is where they can get some of that money back that they feel they deserve from their pain and suffering. So civil litigation has a different standard of proof than criminal law. So with civil cases, it has to be more likely than not that it happens, that it did happen, compared to a criminal case where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So the standard is much, much lower in civil cases. So something that might not have been, if an offender is not found responsible in criminal law, they might be able to be found responsible in civil law. So this allows the victim to control the justice system process with the goal of making the victim whole again. So oftentimes it's not even about the money, and they might know that they're never going to get this money back from the offender, but it often gives a victim sort of a sense of justice if they're not found guilty in criminal court. Again, criminal court is beyond a reasonable doubt. With a civil case, it is more likely than not that it happened. So an example of this is the Route 91 mass shooting lawsuit that happened in Las Vegas in 2017. There's a mass shooting. I believe 50-something people died, and the offender was killed by law enforcement, I believe, or else committed suicide. So 4,400 victims and families of the Las Vegas shooting received $800 million in a civil lawsuit. I believe it was against the hotels. And they said that, it brought closure to the victims because the offender was not able to be tried in court. The offender died before his case, obviously. So it brought just a little bit of closure to them. Obviously, no amount of money is going to bring back their family members, but it did help find the offender responsible. So a minimum of $5,000 was given to each person involved in the suit, and the people that were directly injured received a lot more money. So another right that is afforded to victims is the right to make a victim impact statement. So this is a statement submitted by either the victims or their friends and family, and it's usually presented in court after being found guilty and before sentencing. So sometimes the victims do not want to read their statements outright, so they'll get somebody else working in the court to read them. But a lot of the times it's very therapeutic for victims to, face their offender in the sentencing part of the case and sort of, tell them how their crime affected them. So they tend to talk about, the impacts that they had, whether that be psychological, physical, etc. And this is Chanel Miller. She was the victim of a sexual assault by Brock Turner, and she came forward to help reclaim her identity. So for a long time, they weren't, saying her name because they didn't want her identified, but she said, "No, what? I'm going to reclaim my identity. I'm going to come forward, and I'm going to read this victim impact statement." So some of the benefits that it gives the victims: it allows them to be heard in court, and it allows them to tell their offender just how their actions impacted them. They often say it's very therapeutic as well. And sometimes it helps the judge decide on the sentence. So it might, it's been found that offenders get a little bit harsher sentences when a victim reads an impact statement in court. But then again, not all victims utilize their right to make a victim impact statement. So sometimes people, Chanel was a college graduate, she was very articulate, she was able to craft this, beautifully written impact statement, but not everyone has that opportunity. So if someone has difficulties with writing or communication, maybe they don't speak the language, maybe they're afraid of being in court or seeing their offender, or maybe they just don't know of their right to make a victim impact statement. So another thing that is available to victims is the Victim Witness Assistant Programs. So it provides victims with assistance as they navigate the criminal justice system. So these are usually victim advocates that will allow victims to, have someone on their side, feel like someone's advocating for them. And these advocates usually inform their victim of their rights, and they show them how to access the resources that they might need. So again, the goal here is to increase the victim and witness participation in the criminal justice system. And, they have an advocate that's going to be on their side to go with them to court, and they're going to be more likely to participate in the court process if they have somebody that, knows exactly what's going on. Okay, crime victims often need a variety of different services, whether that be medical services, counseling, access to advocates. So these family justice centers are designed to provide a lot of services and sort of a one-stop shop. So somewhere that a victim can go and receive all the services that they're entitled to. So they provide counseling, advocacy, legal services, healthcare, financial services, housing, etc., etc. Okay, some cases are remedy that some victims might have is to be part of a restorative justice process. So this isn't too common here. It's more common in Australia, New Zealand, those countries. But generally, this is a discussion between all the people that are involved in the crime, so the offender, the victim, justice system officials, and community members as well. So this is sort of a way for victims to get more involved with the case. So it's seen as kind of a pushback from this sort of crime control model that focuses exclusively on the offender and punishing the offender, but it's more about repairing the harms that have been that the offender has done to the victim and, the community at large. So the focus here is on how crime affected the victim. Focus is on repairing the harms rather than punishment. And everyone sort of comes to an agreement on how to repair those harms. So it's not, the justice system telling the offender what they have to do. It's everybody sitting down and having a conversation and decide how to best, fix the situation and make sure everyone's okay with it. Okay, so restorative justice, like I said, is not used very often. It's more effective for juvenile offenders and minor offenses. So if someone is sexually assaulted, they're probably not going to get a restorative justice. They're probably going to go the traditional route of punishment. But it's something like, a teenager vandalizing his neighbor's fence, something very, very minor. Maybe it was a first-time thing. This would be a case where restorative justice would be appropriate. So maybe, the kid and his family and the neighbor and the police officer that arrested him all sit down and decide, okay, instead of taking this to juvenile court, how can we fix everything so everyone's happy? And maybe the kid volunteers to paint the fence and then mow the neighbor's lawn for a month or something. So that would be an example of when it would be appropriate to use restorative justice. But of course, you can't use this in, serious crimes, something like homicide or, rape, or it just would not work for that. When it is used, participants are usually satisfied, but it doesn't necessarily reduce reoffending at all. Again, it's usually only available for very minor offenses, or if that's a little more serious, it's usually used with another sentence as well. Some victims might not be satisfied and not feel that the punishment is sufficient enough for the crime. It's sort of seen as soft on crime, which we know is not a popular stance to have. People do not want to seem soft on crime, so it's not, restorative justice is not used as often. Confronting the offender might be very stressful for the victim as well. So again, if it's a serious assault or a sexual assault, we're not going to be doing this, but in very, very minor cases, it might be okay. Another thing that is a remedy for victims is a victim offender mediation. This is a face-to-face meeting between offender and victim. It's really, similar to restorative justice as well, but it doesn't necessarily involve everyone else in the community. And usually serves as a diversion from prosecution. So this is usually in more minor cases as well. Instead of taking it to court, we do a diversion and try to do a mediation as well. Again, this is for very minor crimes, and it's led by a mediator and the victim offender both stay there. And they decide on restitution for the victim, so what the offender can do to repay the victim for what they did to them. It's been shown to reduce fear and anxiety for the victim, but again, this is something that's only done in very minor crimes. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the victim impact panels. So in these panels, offenders are sentenced to attend a session where the victims, family members, and loved ones discuss the effects of the type of crime had on them. So this is usually used in cases of DUI. So if someone is found guilty of a DUI, they'll usually go to a victim impact panels, and often they'll have people from Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They'll often have maybe some people who have lost family members to drunk driving, and just sort of tell the offender how their crime affects others. So these aren't used too often. Again, it's really commonly used in cases of DUI, but that's sort of, the one type of crime that these are common for. And it's been found that that offenders that attend these victim impact panels are less likely to commit the same crime at a 12-month follow-up.